1,400. And I would like to say welcome to our friends joining us over on YouTube. I think we're live over there now, so good morning to you as well. If you're joining us from YouTube and you would like to join in on this trivia, you can also type your answers into the chat. So my colleague Sarah will be watching our YouTube and sharing everything that you guys type with me, so you guys can participate as well. Oh, we've changed our answer to C. Interesting. Okay, so we have a D changing their mind to C. Do we have any other schools or participants that would like to try guessing how many species of bats there are in the world? And no typing it into Google. This is for fun. You can't cheat. While we're waiting for a couple answers on this one, too, just a reminder, if you guys can put the location of where you're joining us from. So a lot of you guys maybe have your teacher's name or something when you first join. If you go to the 3 dots on the bottom of your screen, you should be able to change your name. So maybe let us know the name of your school and your location, or the name of your teacher and your location. That way it's easier for us to tell where everybody's joining us from. Okay, see, we have a mixture of answers here, some C's and D's. So we're all pretty sure it's not 500 or 800. We think there's a lot more bats than that. You guys are definitely on the right track. So the correct answer for our first trivia question is actually D. There are 1,400 species of bats, and they're found in pretty much every part of the world except really, really extreme climates. You don't find them in Antarctica, but other than that, they're pretty much everywhere on the planet. So just in Canada and the US, we have about 45 species. So lots of bats around the world is the biggest answer. Okay, let's take a look at question number 2 while we're still waiting for a few classes here. How many bats do you think live in the largest bat colony in the world? Ooh, I wonder if anyone's been to this bat colony before. I had some colleagues that visited it once and sent me so many cool videos of it. It's crazy. How many bats do we think live in there? Oh, and I see some of us are updating our location, which is awesome. So good morning, Muriel Martin. Nice to see you, as like always. Grand Woodlands, Chestermere, good morning to all of you. Ooh, we're getting a good mixture of answers for this one. An A, C, D. Gotta see if we can get some consensus on this one. How many bats do you think live in this cave? I know the picture is kind of hard to tell how big the cave actually is. It's pretty big, just to give you guys a little bit of a hint here. So do we think there's 3 million bats that call this place home? Is it 15 million, 20 million, or 2 billion? Give you one last chance to get an answer in if you haven't gotten one. Yeah, I still don't see a consensus. This is a hard one.
There's a couple of B's on YouTube, so...
B's on YouTube? Okay, YouTube is pretty smart over there. I was just admitting to Bailey this morning that I actually forgot the answers to my trivia questions and had to re-Google them. So you're not the only ones who are having a hard time with them. So yeah, our YouTubers are correct. The correct answer for this one is B. So this is called Bracken Cave, and it's in Texas, and it's full of Mexican free-tailed bats. So there are 15 million bats that live in here. I cannot imagine the amount of bat poop that's in there. It's probably pretty crazy. Okay, we've got one more trivia question before we officially get started. What is the wingspan of the largest bat species in the world? So this is a picture of the largest bat species. How wide do we think their wings are when they stretch them out? 50 centimeters, 80 centimeters, 1 meter, or 1.5 meters? So 1.5 meters, that's like taller than most of you guys. So how wide do we think they are? And if you need help thinking about it, picture a ruler or a meter stick in your classroom, right? That's 100 centimeters. So some C's and D's, we're thinking they're 1 meter to 1.5 meters. And a couple more C's. Some of you guys are probably 1 meter tall. That's a good measurement. Okay, last 30 seconds. Get your guess in for this one. Thank you, Trillium Woods, Grand Woodlands, Muriel Martin. Awesome guesses. Lots of B's and C's. All right. Oh, this must have been a hard question. So the answer for this one, guys, is actually D. So they can grow up to 5 feet across, 1.5 meters. So that's like taller than most of you guys are. These guys are giant. They're called a flying fox, and they can be up to 3 pounds in weight and 1.5 meters wide. So it's like wider than my arms. Huge. So we've got bats that go from very, very teeny tiny little bats all the way up to 1.5 meters. and we're going to learn about all of them today. So I would love to welcome you guys officially to Going Bat for Canada's Bats. So we are here to learn about all the wonderful things that have to do with bats and why they're so important to Canada and the world. I would love to begin, as always, with a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the Misquachiwa Skycan. So this is colonially known as Edmonton, and it's on Treaty 6 territory. This land is a traditional meeting place, gathering grounds, and traveling route to many groups, including the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. I would like to also acknowledge all of the traditional territories and lands that you are all on today. Since we're meeting virtually, it's a good opportunity to connect the lands that you each call home around the world. Having a respect for the land that gives you the food, shelter, and life is an important step in the reconciliation process with Indigenous groups around the world. And we're very lucky today to be able to look deeper into our connection with this land and all of the living things that we share it with, not just bats. We have a wonderful opportunity to learn a little more about just one of the amazing creatures that also calls this wonderful world home and the role that they play in the interconnected environment around the world. Just a little idea of what our agenda is going to look like. So it's going to be a very full event. We have a wonderful presentation from our guest speaker, Bailey, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But as always, we saved a little bit of time at the end of our event for some questions. So throughout our event, if you guys have questions that you would like answered, feel free to type them in the chat. If we get a chance to get to them during the event, we will. If not, we will definitely do them at the end. Also, I think some of you guys might have some activity sheets that your teachers printed off for you. So at the end of the event, if you have a nice picture of a bat that you would like to show us on camera, we would love to see your pictures. So if you guys are able to do that, that would be awesome as well. We have a lot of schools joining us today, so I just wanted to take a second to welcome you all. I can't call every single one of you out by name, but we've got lots of Canadian schools joining us to learn about Canadian bats. We also have quite a few schools from around the world that are joining us. So I know some of us might not be watching right now, but whether we're watching right now or sleeping right now and watching this later, I would like to say welcome and thank you for taking the time to learn about bats, and I hope that you're able to see your names up there on the screen. All right, without further ado, I would like to welcome Bailey Bedard. Bailey began studying bats in the summer of 2016 as a summer job at the St. Lawrence River Institute. She enjoyed studying bats during the summers while attending university so much that she decided to continue her education and pursue her master's degree, which involved carrying out her own research. She is now continuing to study her favorite species at the Canadian Wildlife Federation as a bat research technician. They're looking at bat boxes and how they're used across Canada. When Bailey is not studying bats, you can usually find her reading a book, spending time with her cat, or biking along the Rideau Canal. Bailey, welcome, and I hope we maybe get to see this cat at some point during this presentation. Would be awesome.
Unfortunately, I'm in the office today, so I don't have her. If it was a Monday or Tuesday, I'd be working from home, but
next time.
Next time, yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I will pass it over to you, and you can go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Rebecca. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here. Get ready for the presentation.
Looks good.
Awesome. All right. So, hello, everyone. As Rebecca said, I'm Bailey. I'm a bat researcher from the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And today, in spirit of Halloween, I've dressed up in my little bat ears to stay on theme with the presentation. So for today's presentation, I'm going to be talking everything bat. So from different species, different habitat they live in, what they eat, threats they're faced with, and how we as bat researchers study bats. I'm from Canada, so most of my knowledge is on Canadian bat species, but I'm going to go over some general bat information about species from around the world during this presentation. And so a little bit about where I work as a bat researcher, the Canadian Wildlife Federation. It's one of Canada's largest conservation organizations, and our mission is to protect and learn about Canada's wildlife and inspire others to do the same. So that's what I'm hoping to do today with this presentation, spread some knowledge about bats and get you all excited and appreciative of these cool species. So before I get started, let's see in the chat some yeses and nos. Has anybody ever had a real life experience with a bat? Have you ever seen a bat in real life, up close? Was there one in your house maybe? I just want to get a feel of how familiar we are with bats in the chat.
You know, while they're answering as well, I could share a story because I grew up in a rural area, and we found out when we moved on to my farmhouse as a child that there was a bat infestation.
Oh, wow.
So I've been awoken to a bat flying around my room more times than I would like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a common story I hear a lot. It scars some people at a young age. Okay, cool. Yeah, I see. Oh, you've seen some at the zoo. That's cool. Camping, awesome. So you've seen them out in nature. Awesome. Near our school, we have a bat house. Oh, that's awesome. We're going to go over bat boxes later on in this presentation. So that's great that we have some people who know a little bit about them already. Awesome. So that's great. So when I was younger, just like Rebecca, I was kind of scared of bats. I did have a bat in my house at one point growing up. My sister actually ran to go get my mom, saying it was an earwig. So we clearly didn't know much about bats at the time. But since then, I've learned a lot about bats. And from understanding myths from the truth, I clearly began to like bats quite a bit, enough to get a job working with them. So let's get into it. So bats are mammals, just like us humans. And even though they look like mice with wings, they're actually not related to rodents at all. They're more closely related to us humans than they are rodents. They're one of the most widespread mammals, and they can be found almost everywhere in the world. So I'm going to ask you guys to think back to those trivia questions you were answering earlier. You were asked how many bat species exist in the world. So if you remember, there are over 1,400 species that exist. So this is the second largest or second most diverse group of mammals in the world. So this map here on my slideshow shows where all these different types of bats live. The red areas on the map show where the largest number of bats live, and the blue areas on the map show where there's still some diversity in bat species, but just not as many. And then yellow areas fall somewhere in the middle. And then the white areas are where the climate's just too crazy for the bats to exist there. So they avoid those areas in the world. So, like I said, there's tons of different species of bats, and each of these species are a little bit different from one another, whether it be where they live, what they live in, what they eat, their size. So again, thinking back to those trivia questions, you were asked about the largest bat species. So it is called the golden-crowned flying fox. And despite its name having fox in it, they are just very large bats. And the reason they get their name is because their face actually looks a little bit like a fox. I know the idea of a bat this big is kind of spooky, but these bats are actually fruit bats. So they feed on fruit and fruit only. And so they're not going to bother humans at all. So like you learned earlier, these bats' wingspans can reach over 1.5 meters or 5 feet. So if you know how tall you are, you can compare your height with the wingspan of the bat to see how much larger these bats are than you. I'm 5'4", so probably around the same height as this shadow of a person here. So there's definitely some of these bats that are taller than I am, and I'm sure a lot of you are smaller than these species as well. So now let's look at the smallest species in the world, which is, drumroll, the bumblebee bat. So this bat gets its name from being so tiny, just like a bumblebee. Their wingspan is only 6 to 7 inches, or 15 to 18 centimeters. So that's a lot smaller than this fruit bat we were talking about over here. You can see from the photo how small the species really is. It's no bigger than this person's index finger. They weigh only 2 grams, which is kind of hard to imagine just how light that is. So staying on the Halloween theme, I came up with something to compare 2 grams to. So I hope everyone knows what the candy Skittles are. These bumblebee bats weigh the same amount as only 2 Skittles. So that's super, super tiny. They're very little. And there's not a lot of them left in the world. So they're at risk of going extinct, sadly. So there's also differences in what bats eat. And what they eat is directly related to the bat's importance in the ecosystem. So some species, and all of the Canadian species, feed on insects. So they're called insectivores. And a lot of insects are known as pests, like mosquitoes. I'm sure you all really dislike mosquitoes. There's a lot of pests for farmers as well, insects that feed on their crop. And so these insectivore bats eat so many insects that they help keep the insect populations at healthy and manageable levels. Canadian bat species actually eat up to 100% of their own body weight in insects per night. And again, that's kind of a weird number to try and imagine, like how much is 100% of your own body weight. So if I had to eat 100% of my own body weight in one night, I'd have to eat 232 Big Mac burgers from McDonald's between sunset and sunrise. So that's definitely not an easy task. They eat a lot of food each night. And because they eat so many insects, they're known as nature's pesticide because they save farmers so much money on chemical pesticides that they would have to use on their crop if bats didn't exist. Next, there are fruit bats. They're known as frugivores. So they, of course, feed on fruit, like that flying fox we were talking about earlier. So when the bats feed on fruits like mangoes, bananas, figs, they digest most of the fruit except for the fruit seeds. So the seeds are then passed through their stomach and they end up pooping it out. And those bats are basically eating the fruit and then planting new seeds to help those fruit trees spread and grow. So their role in the ecosystem are seed dispersal. Then there's bats that feed on the nectar of flowers. So these bats have long noses and tongues so that they can stick their head into the flower and get right into the center where the nectar is. So when they're feeding on the nectar of a flower and they have their head in this flower, the pollen of the flower gets stuck to their fur, and then they carry that to the next flower they feed on, and therefore they pollinate the next flower. So these types of bats are pollinators. So depending on what the bat is feeding on, they all have very important roles in the ecosystem. There are also bats that feed on fish, which I think is super cool. So I'm going to show you this video of a bat catching a fish to feed on. I'm just going to mute it so I can talk over it. So the bats will fly around over water. They're looking for ripples in the water to signal to them that there's a fish swimming nearby that they can narrow in on. So these bats are looking for the ripples, and once they find one, they time themselves just properly to scoop up the fish with their feet, and then they bring it with their feet to their mouth and they feed. So I'll show it one more time in case you missed it. So he's flying around looking for the ripples. He sees that there's a fish nearby and he times it perfectly so that he's coming in, scooping it up with his feet. In just a second. There we go. And then he'll bring that fish up with his feet to his mouth to eat it. So that's super cool. There's not a lot of bats like that, but that just goes to show how diverse the bats are. So something that's commonly mistaken about bats is the fact that they're blind. This actually isn't the case. They can see perfectly fine. They have the same sort of vision we would. But because a lot of them hunt at night, they need something better than just their eyesight to help them get around. So some species have developed a super sensitive ear, which you can see highlighted in green, the piece of ear that is designed to have supersonic hearing. on the picture of the skull here. So this allows the bat to emit very high-pitched sounds beyond what humans are able to hear. So you can see that in these yellow sound waves on this photo. And these high-pitched sounds will bounce off of whatever is in the bat's way, whether it's a tree or prey. And the sound waves will then echo off that object and move back to the bat. And their super hearing ear allows them to hear that echo, and then they use that to track down their prey or avoid obstacles while flying. But echolocation isn't the only sound bats use. They often live together in very large colonies called roosts, where they hang out and sleep during the day. So you can see in this photo that it often gets pretty crowded in these roosts. And so bats needed to develop a way to communicate with one another, to tell each other, like, hey, move, get out of the way, I'm uncomfortable here. And so we call that chirping. So I'm going to show you another video, this time with the sound on, and you'll hear what this chirping is. So in the video, it's taken from this past summer when we were out catching bats one night. Usually the bats aren't that happy with us holding them. They want to get out and fly around for the night. So they're not afraid to tell us through their chirping that they're pretty annoyed of us. So that's what's happening in this video. So have a listen.
I just want to make sure, Bailey, I think you have to share your sound. I don't see the little microphone, so I don't think it's going to come through. Because we did a reshare since the first one. Yep.
Okay, there we go. Okay. There we go.
This is not a northern, it's a brown.
So that high-pitched chirping sound is the bat trying to tell us, let me go, I'm sick of you guys. I'll play it again.
This is not a northern, it's a brown.
So that's another way they use to communicate with one another and humans when we're bugging them.
This is northern.
So I have another video here. I'm just going to play it while I talk more about the general biology of bats. So I'm going to go over what they kind of do throughout the day and the year. Like I said, they live all throughout the world, meaning they can inhabit many different areas or landscapes like deserts, woods, caves, even in cities and towns. So they'll typically spend their day roosting in either tree hollows, mines, caves, or even in man-made structures like a house or a building. And then during the winter, specifically for North American bats, they either hibernate or migrate south like some birds do. The bats will mate just before the winter before they go into hibernation or migrate. And then the females give birth to one baby bat each year in the early summer months. So let's get some guesses in the chat going while we watch this video. What do you think is the word used to refer to a baby bat? So what do you think baby bats are called? I see a question in the chat. I'll answer while people are getting their answers in. Do I ever get scared? Not anymore. I definitely did when I first started, my first time seeing bats up close and my first time holding one. I'm vaccinated against rabies, which is a requirement to handle bats. So that took away a lot of my fear. So there's a very low risk of catching rabies. So that was my main fear. And even if they do bite you, once you're vaccinated, their teeth are so tiny that you barely feel it. So once I felt what it feels like to be bit, my fear went down like crazy. Okay, I see cuties. That's a good word to describe them. I love that. Pupper cub. I see lots of pups. So great job, guys. The answer is pups. So the pups, like I said, are born at the beginning of the summer. And they're not able to fly within the first few months. So it'll cling to the mother within the roost. And then when the mother goes out to feed, it gets left in the roost for the night. And over the next few months, it then develops the ability to fly. So the moms and the pups will all roost together in very large colonies. And then the males will roost separately in smaller groups or by themselves. And then this cycle goes on through the summers and winters for the whole life of the bat. And they can live up to 30 years. So it's pretty crazy. My video might have not been playing that. Okay. So now that we know how important bats are, again, for pest control, seed dispersal, pollinators, we know that it's very important to protect these so that they continue carrying out these roles in the ecosystem. So in the chat, let's brainstorm some ideas about what you think might be affecting bat populations in a negative way. So think for a minute, brainstorm with your classmates, put your ideas in the chat of things you think bats might be faced with that aren't good for their populations. And while you do that, I'll play another video here of a bat catching moths. Climate change, noise. Yeah, they definitely get annoyed of noise when they're trying to sleep during the day. Predators, pesticides. A lot of bats are actually top predators, so they're pretty lucky in that sense. Disease, such as white nose, that's a great answer. Cutting down trees, I'm not sure if I said that, that's a great answer as well. People killing them, predators. Yes, humans are predators of bats because of a lot of misinformation and people being scared, trapping them, people being scared. Great answers, guys. Yeah, that's awesome. So, I don't know why
Hey, yeah, I don't know why your videos are doing that to you.
I don't
Every
know.
time you jump over to the chat, they freeze on you. I didn't want to interrupt your chat, though.
Well, I'll let it play for a little bit. So a lot of good answers, how the world is changing, people breaking their wings. Yeah, so a lot of the time when people go to get a bat out of their house, of course you don't want to be roommates with the bat, but because they're scared and they're using nets and everything, they don't do it in a proper way, and they oftentimes end up hurting the bat, which eventually leads to the bat dying in a lot of cases. So you guys touched on a lot of good ones that I have here. So wind turbines is one. I don't think anyone mentioned that in the chat. I could be wrong. But yeah, so wind turbines, they'll kill bats as they're flying around at night if the blades are spinning. I saw a few answers about cutting down trees, climate change, things like that. That's all linked to habitat loss. So that's great. Bat exclusions, that ties in everybody's answers about people breaking their wings, people killing them, people being scared of them. So because some of their roosts includes people's attics and houses, a lot of the time people will evict the bats. And if you don't do it in a proper way, it's very harmful for the bats. And even when you do it in a proper way, the bats are then faced with the stress of finding a new home, which uses up some of their energy that they might need to save for the winter. And then I did see an answer about disease and specifically white nose syndrome. So bats in North America are faced with a deadly fungal disease known as white nose syndrome. The fungus exists in the caves that they hibernate in, and it'll grow on the faces and wings of the bat, which you can see in this photo. And how it ends up killing the bats is it ends up waking them up during their hibernation, and then they're expending all the energy that they're supposed to be saving in the winter. So they basically just die of exhaustion while they're supposed to be hibernating. So this specific disease has wiped out a lot of our North American bat populations. So with bat evictions and habitat loss being huge threats to many bat populations, people have been working to identify where different bat roosts are located and protecting those areas so that the bats don't suffer as much. And one way to do this, as someone mentioned in the chat earlier, they have a bat box at the school or nearby the school. So bat boxes are a great way for someone to get involved in helping out bat populations. The idea is it works like a giant bird box or bird house where the bats will move into these boxes in the summer as their summer roost, and they'll hang out there every day, sleeping during the day, and then they'll leave it during the night to go feed. And so by putting up a bat box, you're just providing bats with more habitat as they face different types of habitat loss through forests and bat evictions of houses. So now that you've learned a bunch about bats, let's put your knowledge to the test. Bats are very misunderstood animals, so it's very important that we're sticking up for them because they can't do it themselves. So I want you guys to be able to dispel any myths that you might hear in the future about bats. So let's go through them. If you go to the poll function, you'll be able to vote yes or no to some of these statements. So the first one, are bats blind? I'm gonna have a look at the poll as you guys vote. If you think back, we talked about this earlier, so I am hoping we have a good
I think these students were definitely listening to the presentation.
yes, it's looking good. So we have 90% saying no, 91% saying no. Okay, so it's going up. So great job, guys. Good listening. Bats are not blind. Very common misconception you hear about bats. They see perfectly fine, but they use echolocation to hunt at night to help them kind of see using their ears. So that's where that misconception comes from. All right. So great job. The answer is no. The next one, are bats vampires? I'll keep an eye on the poll again. We didn't talk about this, so this is really testing your bat knowledge.
I do remember a little story about bat bites, so that could be a little bit of a hint.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have not a single yes. That's awesome. Transylvania in the chat, yeah. So, no, bats are not vampires. It's another very common myth we often hear. There are 3 species in the world that actually do drink blood as their way of feeding, but not of humans, not human blood. They feed on livestock, so cows, pigs, horses. So there's no reason to be scared. And in Canada, like I said, there's no, in North America, there's no vampire bats. None of them eat blood or feed on blood in our area here. Okay, next. Will bats get stuck in your hair, or do they get stuck in people's hair? We talked a little bit about echolocation and how sensitive their ears are when they use it. So maybe think about that while you're answering. This one's kind of more split. Some yeses and nos. Although there's more no's for sure.
Maybe they're using your headband as a hint for this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. All right. So we have 75%. So 3/4 are saying no. Great job, guys. This is another common myth, and I don't blame the people who said yes, because it's often shown in movies or told in stories that bats are stuck in people's hair. It's actually not the case. So with their echolocation, it's actually so sensitive that they can detect a single strand of human hair. So they're going to avoid it at all costs every time. So they're not going to get stuck in your hair. So finally, do bats carry disease and viruses? Let's see some answers in the poll. A lot of yeses so far. We did talk about this a little, so. No. Awesome. Okay, so majority is saying yes in this case. And the answer is yes, but there's no reason to worry. because like all wildlife, you should be avoiding coming into close contact with bats. You should never be handling a bat unless you're a trained bat expert. So if you're following those general rules, you have nothing to worry about. Rabies and other diseases that can come from bats are only transferred through their bites. So if you leave handling bats to the bat experts, you're going to be safe. If you ever were to come into contact with a bat, it's very important that you do go see a doctor and tell somebody. But if you're following proper wildlife guidelines, you have nothing to worry about. So, despite everything you've learned about bats today, there's still plenty of things that we don't know about bats. So that's why researchers like me are trying to learn more about the species. So there's 3 species in Canada that are endangered, and I'm working on doing 2 things to try and protect these endangered species. One of them, looking at how successful bat boxes are as for bats to use them as a roost. So is there a certain design or style that bats prefer more than others? And I'm also trying to identify new bat roosts so that we can protect those areas. So I think I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm gonna maybe go a little bit quicker through these ones. So
I wouldn't worry about it, Bailey. You keep going, and if they have questions, they'll pop them in the chat. So don't feel like you've got to rush. We have 10, 15 more minutes. So.
Okay, sounds good. So this slide here shows the different, how much variety you can have in the bat boxes. So there's ones shaped like rockets. We call them rocket boxes. Bat condos, which are just giant bat boxes. This one is very far out in a marsh, installed on a dead tree. Whoever has this box decided to paint Batman on it. This one specifically, I went out to see this summer. It's 2 small bat boxes back to back, and there were actually bats living in it. These ones are made out of cement instead of wood, as most of them are. And this person put 4 bat boxes side by side to make one giant bat box. So there's tons of variability. So like I said, I'm going around checking bat boxes and seeing if I can determine a pattern of a certain color bats prefer in a bat box, or do they have to be so high up so that bats can use them? So that's what we're looking at right now. So when we go around to check them, what we do is we just shine a flashlight up directly under the bat box, and this is what we'll see if it's occupied. So you can see all their little faces. Like I said earlier, they crowd really tight together, which is why they chirp at each other all the time. So here's just a few more photos. The ones here with less bats are likely to be males. Like I said, they tend to roost in very small groups or by themselves often. This one as well, it's kind of hard to see, but it looks like there's 1 here and 2 here. So again, it's probably a very small colony of males roosting together during the day. You can also monitor your bat box at night just by going out at sunset and looking at the bat box and counting if there's any bats leaving the box to go out and feed. So that way you can, if you know bats are living in your bat box, it's a good way of getting an exact or a roughly exact number of how many bats are actually living in your bat box. So you can see this bat flying out for the night. And then when we're going to identify new roosts, we're trying to track bats and where they go during the day. So usually the first step is a homeowner calling us saying, hey, I think I have a large pile of bat poop, or guano as it's called, outside of my house along the wall. I think bats are living in my house. So we'll check out the pile of guano, which is photographed here. And once we confirm, like, yeah, this looks like a decent colony, a large amount of bats, we should come back and catch them. We'll go back and we'll set up these bat nets. They look like very big volleyball nets. We set them up strategically because, like I said, with their echolocation, they'd be able to detect this. So we set it up around sharp corners so that they detect it too late and they fly into it and get tangled. The bats will get tangled in the net. It doesn't hurt them. They're just tangled up and can't move. So when we see them in the net, we'll immediately go carefully untangle them. And then we'll throw them in these bat bags. They're much calmer in the bags than they are tangled up in the net. So we put them in the bat bags and we hang them up on almost like a clothespin until we're ready to process them one by one. So once we're ready to process them, we'll take the bat out, we weigh the bag, and then we throw the bat back in the bag and weigh it while it's in the bag. And then we can subtract the weight of the bag from the total weight to see how much the bat weighs. Then we determine what species the bat is, if it's male or female, and how old the bat is. So we can't determine exact age of the bat by like how many years old it is, but we can see if it's an adult or a pup. And to do that, we extend the wing over a flashlight like I'm doing here. You could see this little kind of bulge along one of the fingers, and that's its knuckle. So for pups, their knuckles aren't fully developed yet. So there's not a fully dense bone in that knuckle. And when you hold it against light, you can actually see through it. So that's how we know it's a pup. Whereas the adults will have fully developed bone in their knuckle and you can't see through it held up against the light. So that's how we know if it's an adult or a pup. We will slip these tiny little bands like a bracelet on the wrist of the bat. And each band has a unique number on it that will tell us if we ever recapture it, that it's that same bat. So we keep track of all these ID numbers in our notes. So that way, if we ever recapture it, we'll know that it's that same bat. And then we put these little radio trackers on their back. Again, this doesn't hurt them. We just use skin adhesive, which wears off in 2 to 3 weeks, and the tracker will fall off. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we track the bats in a few slides. And then finally, we release the bat. So you can see it, that radio tag sticking out from the bat. And I'll show you a little slow-mo video of a release. We just hold it and let it fly off when it's ready. So there we go. So like I said, those little radio tags we use to track the bats. So we have this radio that we hold, and it's attached to an antenna, like James is holding here. And each of those tags on the back of the bat acts as its own type of kind of radio channel if you're thinking about listening to the radio in like your car. So we'll channel this radio to a specific channel, and then when we point the antenna anywhere that the bat is, we'll pick up its signal and the radio will start beeping. So I'll show you a video just so you can hear the beeping, and there's some talking in the video to kind of explain it as well.
Certain they're up under the eave along the soffit of this community center.
So you can hear that beeping, that right there. That's signaling that the bat is somewhere in that house. People are saying questions before we're done. Okay, so I'm gonna just wrap up. I'm wrapping up right now. So I'll go over some things that you can do to help the bats yourself. If you want to help the bats, go to helpthebats.ca. We have tons of resources on there. How to build a bat box, or what to look for when buying ones if you want to put one up in your own yard. How to tend to your garden in a way that benefits bats by attracting insects they eat, not necessarily mosquitoes. We have bat adoption trick-or-treating kits where all the money goes to our bat conservation research, and resources if you want to throw a bat party fundraiser, all on helpthebats.ca. And the biggest thing you can do is take everything you learned today and spread that knowledge. So learn about the bats in your area, tell people about them, make people know that they should be appreciative of bats, and just spreading that knowledge and help bust those bat myths that you often hear. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I hope we have some time for questions. still. And if you have any bat stories, or if you want to show your bat activities, like Rebecca said, I'd love to see or hear the stories you have.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Bailey. That was wonderful. I do feel like you had so much great information. We have not had a lot of questions come through the chat, so I think we've covered a lot of ground. But yes, just a reminder, if you guys would like to share something on camera, feel free to just turn your cameras on. We will spotlight you so that our speaker is able to see you. We only have a few minutes left. If you have to leave in the next 4 minutes, because I know it ends at 45, you're welcome to say bye in the chat and exit. But while we have time, we might go a few minutes over just to answer a few questions before the end of the presentation. So I think you can probably see these coming up in the chat, but
Yeah.
Can you tame a pet, and can you have one as a pet?
So that's a great question. I'm sure there's cases somewhere around the world that somebody's tamed a bat. I wouldn't suggest keeping it as a pet just because of the disease and how much they poop. But the roosts, if they're using your house or bat box as a roost, they're very loyal to those roosts. So they'll come back pretty much every day to stay there. And then when they leave for the winter and come back the next spring, majority of the time, if not every single time, they will come back to that same roost. So if you have bats living in your house or your bat box, they're kind of like your pets because they keep coming back every day and then again in the summer. Is my favorite animal bats? I do love bats. They are definitely my favorite animal. Dogs and cats, obviously, a close second, third. And I also love sloths. Sloths have been my favorite animal almost my whole life until I started studying bats. So they're close up there too, but bats definitely my favorite.
Awesome. I think we have a question from St. Angela. If you guys wanted to ask yours on camera, you guys can go ahead.
Go ahead.
How does the bat not suffocate? How does the bat not suffocate in the bag?
How does the bat not suffocate in the bag? They're airy. They don't even close all the way. It's one of those kind of drawstring bags and it leaves a little hole up there. And they're only left in for maybe, I want to say a max of 10 minutes. So they're not in there long enough to suffocate.
That's a good question. There's another one that came in through the chat too. Do you know if there's any other diseases that affect bats like the white nose does?
Yeah, so I'm sure everybody's heard of COVID by now. There's just like in humans, there's lots of different variants of COVID. And a lot of those variants exist in bat populations. So diseases like that, different viruses, again, rabies is one. An interesting thing about the COVID virus affecting bats is that even though they do carry a lot of different COVID variants, bats in Canada at least don't have our specific COVID-19 variant. So these past few years studying bats, we were actually wearing masks when within 6 feet of bats to prevent us from giving it to them so that they're not faced with another disease that they have to deal with, putting them more at risk. So yeah, that's an interesting fact that it's another common misconception because of all the news about COVID and bats. So yeah.
I'm gonna let you go ahead and answer this next one about the babies, but while you're answering it, I don't want to distract you, but I am just going to share my screen for any of those schools that have to hop off because we do have more events coming up with the CWF. So if you guys enjoyed the BAT event and would like to do more similar ones, you can scan this QR code. I will also just pop the link into the chat so you guys can have it as well. But anyways, back to the questions. There's a question in there, I think, about number of babies.
Yeah, how many babies will a bat have in its life? So I believe that once a bat reaches like 1 year old, so it's a pup for that first year where it can't fly during the summer and all that. And then I believe the next summer, that bat, if it's a female, is able to have a baby. So ever since it's 1 year old, it'll have one, some even are able to have twins. So it can have like 1 to 2 pups each year, and it'll continue to do that for its whole life. So upwards of 30 years. So probably around 30 babies in its whole lifetime. Could be a little more, could be a little less if they don't survive or whatever the case may be. But yeah, it's up there.
Eating 200 hamburgers in a night and having 30 babies in their life. That's crazy.
Yeah. What a life.
Okay, so we'll do one more question before I ask you kind of my final wrap-up question. So how much does a bat weigh?
Well, that varies depending on the species. So those big flying foxes are going to weigh a lot more than the bumblebee bat. The ones that I handle, I believe they're around like a pound. They're very tiny, very tiny.
Awesome. And do you know if there ever was a species bigger than that flying fox? That one's kind of related.
Oh, that's a good question. Truthfully, I don't know the answer to that. Today, that's the flying fox is the biggest species, but I'm sure there has been species bigger than that that are now extinct. And I do believe there was a fossil dug up recently in eastern Canada that was very big. I'm not sure if it was bigger than the flying fox, though. That's a good question. I'd have to look more into it.
Yeah, I know. Like, you think back to like giant dinosaurs and stuff. Like, there had
Yeah, there was
bats.
definitely bats bigger.
Okay. Final question. I'm just going to thank you, Muriel Martin, for stopping in. I know some of our classes do have to hop out. My final question I wanted to ask you was, what is your like final thoughts or takeaway that you had for all of the students here today?
Well, like I said, I think the most important thing is just getting the word out there. So a lot of bats, like the bumblebee bat, that really tiny one, they're at risk of going extinct. There's only 4,000 left in the world. So they can't stand up for themselves. They can't tell people how to best help them. So of course research is important, but I think the most important thing is just getting the word out there and standing up for bats for them, since they can't do it themselves.
Where do I start? Of course, energy
I hope
efficiency, carbon
you
capture
all learned
utilization, and storage.
something
Or
new
you might hear it
today
as the term
and
meteorological
gained
removal.
an appreciation
At
for
times, the
bats,
pace for
whether it's their
methane
diversity,
mitigation,
the cool
responsible
roles they play in the
agriculture and food
ecosystem,
production.
and
These
if
types of
you
things are really
can't go
important to bring to the table.
if you can't put up
Third,
a bat box, or if you
electricity
don't have a garden
transition.
to make bat
Still an area
friendly,
where we're
you can
talking
still go
Canada,
around and
probably
bust
ahead of
myths
most of
about
the world.
bats.
As you
So
know, our grid is
that's still
relatively
doing its
green
part,
in
and
this
I think it's
country,
a very
but more and
important
more we're supporting
thing to
countries
do.
across the world make that transition.
Awesome. Thank you
So
very much.
Canada has committed,
And
I
yes,
think, as
I'm
you know, to
picturing
being off coal
everybody
by 2030.
going out and
Alberta
building
did
bat
make that
boxes.
commitment
That would be
before Canada, but
amazing. But
frankly,
yes,
we're going to
we
be
were
off
just
coal
talking
in
about that, so that's great. So
2023.
thank you
And not
very
only
much.
will we be off coal in
There might be a couple
2023,
last
we're doing it
questions
through
while we let
really
people
checks and
hop off the
balances on
meeting, but
affordability,
I would like to say
reliability, and
thank you to everybody for joining
technological
us. If you would
feasibility.
like to, Bailey, you're
So for
welcome to say and
us,
answer. I
and
think
it
we
was
have
also done with a
questions
commitment
about
of just
hibernation in the
transition.
bumblebee, but
Speaks
if
to those
not, you guys are welcome to
communities that
get
rely
going. Thank you
on
very much for
coal
joining us, and we
production
appreciate it.
for supporting electricity generation, have jobs to transition to.
Awesome.
And
So
we're not
the
just
question, do all
transitioning
bats
out of coal,
hibernate?
so that jobs and affordability side is really important.
I believe that
Fourth
they
area
all at
is
least
nature-based
go into
solutions.
some sort of
Something that I think many of you will know about
rest period, not necessarily hibernation. It all depends on where they live. And with them, there being over 1,400 species, I don't know everything about all the species, so I could be wrong, but I think there's at least some point in the year for most species that they either hibernate or they find somewhere warmer to go. So some of our species in Canada fly south, like I said, just like some birds do, so that they're saving energy in those colder months and not having to keep warm.
Yeah, and Mary Claude had a couple questions about the bumblebee bat. Is it in Canada, and have you ever held one?
It is not in Canada. I believe I had it pulled up.
And I think I can answer for the flying fox. I'm pretty sure that one was in the Philippines when I was looking into that one before. It is definitely not in Canada. I've never seen a bat that gigantic.
No. Okay, the bumblebee bat is in Thailand. So it doesn't exist in Canada. And I've never held either of them. I've only held Canadian species, and only 3 different species actually, because we don't have that many in Canada. But
All
I
right.
would love to.
Yeah, totally. Imagine holding that gigantic
Yeah.
bat.
I don't know if I could.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for all of you guys' wonderful questions, and thank you, Bailey, for staying a few extra minutes to answer them, and for your great presentation. We really appreciate it. So, happy Halloween, everybody, and I hope that you guys all learned a little bit about bats like I did. Great.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.